the Piedmont, president of the Piedmont Environmental Council. Really glad to have this incredible panel as our first quarterly keynote for 2022. We've really benefited from the opportunity to put on these keynotes every quarter, and this is an exciting one about the directions and philanthropy in our part of the world. For those of you who don't know anything about PEC, and I don't think there are very many, we're in our 50th anniversary year. We're celebrating 50 years of work protecting and promoting the rural economy, the natural resources, the history, beauty, and the communities of the Virginia Piedmont. And really proud of the work that we've done, proud of our connections to community, and really believe in the mission of serving the places that we work in. So this is a great opportunity to host a discussion about philanthropy. We're beneficiaries, but we're also part of finding ways to be more helpful in the communities that we work. Our panelists tonight from Path Foundation, Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation are all experts. They're all doing great work. Collectively and individually, these philanthropic organizations have worked diligently to address the many challenges in our region that been both highlighted and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The work they do equates to more than simply just grant making. They are active leaders and partners in the realm of ensuring food security, affordable housing, access to recreational opportunities. They've supported PEC in such efforts as our Piedmont Milk Initiative, which provided fresh, high nutrition milk to local food pantries at no cost in the early days of the pandemic. And they've also helped us with the creation of recreational access points along the Rappahannock River, as well as a number of other projects in our communities. Thank you to Kirsten and Cindy and Renard for taking the time to be here with us today, and we look forward to your insights on this topic. I'm going to hand off the discussion to be moderated by our own John McCarthy. John joined our staff in 2017 after a 28-year stint as Rappahannock County Administrator. And then you hear the loud background noise of a guard Airedale, part of the atmosphere. John has served as a member and officer of the Rappahannock-Rapidan Regional Commission, and as a part of the Virginia Municipal League insurance programs, as well as on numerous nonprofit organizations, governing boards, including as chairman of the Fauquier Hospital Board, the Path Foundation, and the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation. Since joining PEC, he's been a key advocate in the preservation of the quality of life and natural resources in the Piedmont. Most importantly, he's been a great partner in helping me continue to move PEC forward and to continue to run the programs that we offer. So John, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and thank you very much for organizing and moderating today's program.
Absolutely, Chris. Thanks very much for that very generous introduction. As you sort of alluded to, though, I have an absurdly easy job tonight because I've been involved in all three of the organizations who are represented by the able speakers who they sent to us tonight. And I count myself the friend of all of them. They're all very talented professionals, and they're going to have a lot to say about the state of philanthropy. The first I will introduce to you is Kirsten Duik. She is the Senior Program Officer with the Path Foundation here in Warrenton. Kirsten, you want to talk a little bit about what Path Foundation does in your role with Path?
Sure, thanks. And thanks everybody for this invitation tonight. I'm really enjoying being with you. I'm a senior program officer at the Path Foundation, which is a grant-making foundation created in 2013 to support the health and vitality of the community. We work in Culpeper, Rappahannock, and Fauquier counties. And our areas of focus are childhood wellness, mental health, senior services, and access to care, which is a very broad category that includes many of the things that PEC and PEC supporters are most interested in.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. Secondly, we'll turn to Cindy Coulson, who's the Deputy Director of Strategic Partnerships with the Center for Nonprofit Excellence.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for everyone who's joined us. So I'm going to bring kind of a unique perspective to our conversation this evening. Just like PEC, CNE is a recipient of monies. We are a nonprofit with an origin story in Charlottesville, but we work with organizations throughout the state and have an office in Warrenton. The best way to describe our work, as I say, there's two things you need to know that we hold to be true. The first is that we believe nonprofits are instrumental to the quality of life in any community. The second thing that we hold to be true is the stronger, more robust, more vibrant those nonprofits, the stronger, more robust, more vibrant those communities. So CNE exists to bring trainings, technical assistance, consulting, resources to nonprofits to strengthen their work, to result in strengthening those communities. We work a lot with funders, so I'll be bringing the perspective from nonprofits and also our conversation with funders as well. So thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Cindy. Last but absolutely not least is Renard Carlos, who's the Program and Communications Manager with the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation. I first met Renard as he came on the town council here in Warrenton, where he still serves. So he's a man of many parts, and I will turn it to you, Renard.
Well, thanks so much, John, and thank you guys for the opportunity to join you for this event. So, you know, I've got the opportunity to serve as you've already mentioned, as the Program and Communication Manager for the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation. Somewhat of a little bit of my background. So I'm a government and national politics student from George Mason. As John already mentioned, I had the opportunity to be elected to serve in the Warrenton Town Council. I've also had the opportunity to serve as a board member for the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation. Then most recently made a change to actually begin to work with the foundation as well. So kind of get two different angles to be able to share our information with tonight. So I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Renard. We have a series of questions that we have prepared and wanted to discuss first. We also, as James already mentioned earlier, we're going to be accepting questions added into the chat. So please do think about that as we go through the conversation. The first question I wanted to spring on all three, and I will go in with the order of Kirsten, Cindy, and Renard for this first one, and then in reverse order back through until I forget where I am, in which case I'll just go to whoever I point to and we'll just go with that. But the first question tonight is particularly looming in my mind because I had an opportunity last week to go speak to the employees of the Rappahannock-Rapidan Health District. And one of the speakers that preceded me made the comment about, isn't it great to be at the end of the pandemic? And I thought, oh, I wonder how that's going to get a reaction from the people in the room. And there was an audible groan from the members of the health district's employees. They didn't feel like they were at the end of the pandemic yet and were very much worried about what the next step was going to come. And with that as prologue, I'll say, what are you hearing from the communities you serve in terms of need now that we are at least 2 years into the pandemic? I won't even say that we're at the end of the pandemic. So Kirsten, you want to take that first?
Sure. Maybe the best way to answer that is to look at it through the lens of our most recent grant opportunity, which was a flexible funding round that we just did last month. We had 60 applications for general operating and unrestricted funding for a total of $2.9 million in requests. That's a little bit down from the deepest days of the pandemic, but it's still significant and it's still quite a bit above kind of historic rates of requests, both in number of applications and by dollar. I would say we saw some patterns in those applications. COVID-related needs are still very much with us. We had a lot of applications from area nonprofits that were continuing to prioritize really basic human services and needs: childcare, housing, shelter, food, and especially notable, I think, as we saw an increasing emphasis from our childhood wellness applicants around trauma-informed care for children. We're also seeing some pressure created by the return to service and the need to service a backlog of needs and fewer people to do it. So a lot of transition in staff trying to meet, still really urgent need. But I would also say, and this is maybe the most hopeful piece, we're also seeing a lot of emerging creativity and new ideas. Some organizations that are emerging from survival mode and really coming forward with creative, innovative, forward-looking programs, probably in many cases characterized by some deep thinking they did in partnership with CNE during the pandemic, and really ready to move forward, we had probably half a dozen applications this year for brand new programs or new strategic direction. And I think that's a good sign for a healthy community and the health of the nonprofits in the community at large.
Great, interesting. All right. Well, you've teed that up perfectly for Cindy then. So Cindy, what are you seeing?
Yes, you did, Kirsten. Thank you. So a lot of my talking points were very much the same. You know, a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, certainly coming back in full, but full in terms of providing services, but not necessarily fully staffed because of where we are. But the new things that I would offer is that a study just came out by Candid or by GuideStar March 3rd of this year. So just a month ago. And the study was citing that there's still significant struggle for nonprofits. They're anticipating at least a third of nonprofits are still in financial jeopardy, particularly our arts and education. Nonprofits were significantly hit in March of 2020, and that is reverberating into 2022. I'm also working with nonprofits in terms of the replenishment of their operating reserves, if they were fortunate enough to have that. One thing that we did observe at CNE in 2020 is those organizations that had operating reserves entered COVID in a very different place than those organizations that did not have reserves. They were able to pivot, get services in place, but they tapped out those reserves over the last 2 years. And so it becomes now a question of how do we replenish that reserve to ensure that whatever may come next, that we're able to do that investment. And the third thing that I'll say that I'm hearing from nonprofits and with donors is this awareness of how funding could look differently, like how in terms of the grant application could look different, the impact of having unrestricted monies and what that allowed nonprofits to do, and wanting to have this ongoing conversation with funders of, as we're looking forward, where there some opportunities to take these lessons learned and move those into a new space. The other little caveat I'll say about funding as well is the impact of short-term grants. When organizations were needing to pivot and make all these changes, one-year grants was becoming very challenging to apply for, report to, et cetera, in the midst of everything else they had to do their work. So there's some conversation about, can we revisit kind of the one-year term for grants?
Interesting. Okay. Renard, we'll turn to you for the same question.
Sure, absolutely. I think what everyone's kind of said, ditto. But I think one of the unique things that, as far as I've seen with the COVID, it gave nonprofits, and then certainly for us, specifically with the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation, an opportunity to really show the community what it is that nonprofits do. And so one of the big things for me, I remember speaking with a nonprofit, you hear about the work that's being done, but you kind of hear about it, but it's until you're actually in that situation and you really start to understand why nonprofits are vital to us. I'll give you an example. One of them was the food banks, right? We all have heard about food banks, and you have a certain thought process in your mind about what food banks are, who would use food banks. COVID changed that completely. You had folks who, white collar jobs, have a certain type of lifestyle, who had never imagined going to a food bank ever in their lives. They were suddenly finding themselves at food banks. And so it allowed the nonprofits really to step up and say, hey, here's where we're vital to the community. So one of the things that we did with the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation is during COVID, we created an emergency response fund. We simplified our process for our nonprofits and really kind of getting boots on the ground, if you would, say what works for you, what doesn't work, how can we, help the work that you're doing. Part of that, again, was simplifying the process. What we're doing, we changed a little bit from the not just looking at programming necessarily, but operating, with the big change that we've done as far as funding for staff members. And there's also a big opportunity to work with local governments, whether it's town government, whether it's county, statewide, to come in as subject experts, kind of work with those folks who were getting, we had COVID dollars being given to local municipalities and governments, to also help them implement those things as being the subject experts working with the nonprofits. So those are just a few things that we did at the Northern Piedmont Community Foundation to address the COVID.
Interesting. All three of you sort of bring in the fact that you had to change some of the ways you did business to remain topical and connected to the communities and be responsive to the needs of the community as they evolved during the pandemic. given the roller coaster ride the economy has been on in the last 2 years, whether it was the utter chaos that entered the markets in the early days of the investment markets in the early days of the pandemic, or unemployment spiking and then tailing off, and now inflation rearing its ugly head again for the first time in many people's professional memory, or at least more severe than it's been in times past that most of us recall. How has the donor community responded? And I'll do it in reverse like I warned you I would. So I'll start with Renard and then go to Cindy and Kirsten. So Renard, what are you seeing out there in people who donate to Northern Piedmont Community Foundation?
Sure, that's a great question. I think one of the things you would think with all the challenges that you just laid out, whether it's inflation, whether there's it feels like there's a plethora of different folks who are vying for funding. You would feel as if the funds may have dried up. But what we found here at Northern Piedmont Community Foundation is our donors were, they were leading the charge, saying, hey, how can we help? What can we do? And so I think, maybe for us in Northern Piedmont, one of the ways that we kind of capture that energy, if you would, because everyone wanted to give. Again, I talked very briefly with you about it as far as, hey, some of our donors, I've never been to the food pantry before. I actually went there. Now I understand how vital this world is. What can we do? And so we took that energy and we focused it into specific programs for our groups and then reaching out with the nonprofits. So it seems like it would be the opposite, but we've had donors their funding has not dried up. It's actually gone above and beyond to continue to be part of the solution with the community.
Great. So the crisis led to education, which is always a good result. So Cindy, what are you seeing?
Innovation. We were talking about how nonprofits were innovative. Funders are the same. They're being very innovative in the way that they're approaching their support of nonprofits. We're seeing a continuation of the unrestricted monies that we saw. We're seeing less onerous applications, and where the application process isn't intended to eliminate candidates as much as identify partners. Like, where are we really aligned? So some of the questions are shifting, the perspective looks different. Investment in BIPOC organizations. We're seeing a huge investment in the recognition of the disparity of organizations led by BIPOC individuals and the investment that's happening there.
Great, good. All right, Kirsten, a little different
Yeah.
situation since you're not a donor-based organization, you're a granting organization, but you work with a lot of nonprofits who are, so.
Sure. Actually, the question takes me back to something that Renard raised earlier about the way that the community has turned to safety net organizations like food banks. That in turn put a really interesting need or emphasis on how those organizations were going to work. They were changing. Not only were they growing to serve more people, but they were providing technical assistance to people who had never thought of themselves, who had never been customers or clients of those nonprofits before. And so there was a real deepening, I think, of the relationships in the community. And for those of us who funded those nonprofits, there was an urgent need to expand and make more flexible the way we fund those organizations, not only in terms of the number of dollars that we push out or the availability of emergency funding, but capacity funding for those organizations that found themselves spending more time holding hands with their clients, teaching them through processes that were very unfamiliar to them. And so as we thought about loosening and revising and rethinking some of our grant making criteria, we had to do a pretty deep think into how our requirements, our guidelines, our processes helped or hindered that process. And we came down firmly on the side of do all you can to help.
Right. Yeah, as I think others have observed, if you're the umbrella for your community and it's raining, that's time to put up the umbrella, not to argue about what's the best thing to do. So just to mix it up, I'll go to Cindy next. And you've talked, the first two questions really dealt on the first side with the impacts on the communities and the nonprofits you work with. The second sort of talked about the donors who support the nonprofits you work with. Talk to me a little bit about how your organization had to change the way it internally, managed things and internal dynamics to find the best way to support the communities you serve. Cindy, can we start with you on that?
Certainly. We use the frame, we became radically responsive is how we defined our work. We see our role as being on the, ideally kind of ahead of the wave, if you will, so that we're the information gatherer and share with the nonprofits. So just to give you an idea, in 2 months, so beginning in the middle of March through the end of May, we were providing processes and policies around working remotely, HR policies around how do we deal with sick individuals who want to continue to work. We don't have policies for that. Access to personal protection equipment, tools for programming remotely. How do we pivot into the space where we don't have the technology or the tools or the knowledge to do that? Hibernation. Some organizations recognizing that they needed to gear down really low to save money to get through whatever time they needed to. Mental health, we teed that up right up in April, recognizing the trends we were seeing with clients and staff in nonprofits. PPP loans, what a wonderful gift that was. It's wonderful if you had a relationship with a banker. Most nonprofits did not. Many nonprofits just had a bank account. They didn't have a relationship with a banker, as you would expect small businesses who may have loans. So we had to help nonprofits to navigate through that, navigate through the application process, navigate through the forgiveness process with that, and social justice. All of that in 2 months hit us, and it just kept coming. So that radical responsiveness, which we've sustained, realizing that now there's so many shifts and changes that are occurring. How do we continue to be responsive in a way that gets our nonprofits the information they need so they can engage their clients, their donors, their community in the work they're doing?
Yeah, a lot of change in a big hurry. Kirsten, why don't we turn to you next to the same question? How's PATH changed to meet these needs?
Sure. Very similar to what we're hearing across the board. One of the things that we did first off was sign onto the Council of Foundations Philanthropy Pledge, which really called on grant makers to loosen or eliminate restrictions on current grants, to examine and expand the inclusiveness of prospective grants. We contributed to community-based emergency response funds like the one at Northern Piedmont Community Foundation. And as the pandemic evolved, I think we saw the benefit of something that had been in our culture and really made it even more intentional and even more transparent, which was the culture of regular communication with area nonprofits, understanding their immediate and emerging needs as well as their broader visions. We stepped up to make unrestricted and general operating funds much more widely available. It was something that we had done occasionally up until now. It is really the core of our grant making at this point. It's something that we have now done for several years running, and has been, I think it was the right thing to do in this time. So things like flexible funding and the Better Together grants. We've increased our budget for technical assistance to support capacity of nonprofits. And then we did other things like working in collaboration with the Department of Health for things like testing and vaccine clinics, and pushing out their communication efforts. So trying to be responsive and not only adaptable as an organization, but really continuing to listen to and respond to the constantly evolving needs that we were seeing coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, Renard.
Sure, thank you. I think certainly to kind of echo what everyone else has said, I think one of the big major things that we saw with Northern Piedmont Community Foundation is just the pandemic and the environment in the last 2 years. It changed philanthropy a lot. So I think traditionally we thought philanthropy looks like this. And as a lot of folks have already said, we had to kind of reimagine what it was that philanthropy looked like. And so one of the ways trying to be flexible to what we were doing, I've already mentioned how we did our emergency response grant. We changed some of our funding matrix. We simplified the process. And then also, again, we made a change from not just programming, but then also, hey, here's what you need for operating. But I think the other thing that we really became very apparent in the need is really starting to understand and make it a priority for the connections that a community foundation has with your nonprofits. And to a certain degree to say, we're all in the same sandbox, if you would. right? And so how do we make sure that we connect folks with this person? So not if you come to us and we don't necessarily have the answer for you, hey, I may not be able to answer your question, but I know PATH does, or I know C&E does. But really kind of evolving our processes, not just thinking about grants and funding, but also that the support matrix that goes along with what we do to support our nonprofits. And I think that was a huge, maybe a little bit of a shift, you know, in a lot of community foundations, maybe PATH, maybe C&E as well. But I know certainly for Northern Piedmont, from being on the board and then now certainly working with them, that to say, hey, how do we make sure that we create this strong framework of support for all of our nonprofits outside just our grant giving?
Thank you. One of the things that has struck me is that sometimes, as a recovering county administrator, I will say that sometimes local government's awareness of and reliance on nonprofits are at some distance from each other. They're not aware of how much nonprofits do until the rubber meets the proverbial road. And I think over the last 2 years, we've had a lot of rubber meeting the road. Is it your sense as a local government official that local governments in general are feeling like the nonprofit community is more important than they might once have thought?
Sure. Look, I could talk all night on this, so I won't. But let me be brief. So one of the things that I found as being a government official is that there are things that government officials can do and local governments can do, and there's probably some different philosophies, things that they probably shouldn't do or cannot do. One of the things that I've seen is that, you know, non-intentional, right? But there are these pockets that seem to be left out where, you know, government is trying to act and do what we can do during a pandemic, and you get we're doing this, we're doing that. And it's these middle groups that, you know, government just cannot act in enough time or enough space or, you know, for whatever reasons, but that we have specifically seen that this is why you have nonprofits. And it's the role, a prime example, childcare was huge. And so you're not going to be able to fund a childcare program as a local government, right? We're trying to figure out all the other operating things that we have to do, but it was a huge need within your community. So how do you do that? And I think it's issues like that our nonprofits have stepped up and really saying, hey, we can do that. Or, hey, we have the boots on the ground. We know about XYZ childcare. We know about this group who provides this for you know, early education and things like that. I think that the nonprofits, you know, during COVID have had a huge opportunity. I think they've taken advantage of it to show government organizations, not just that we're here, but that also we can partner with you. And we're also subject experts on some of the areas that you guys have not had an opportunity to, you know, maybe invest in. So I think it's been a great opportunity for that collaboration between the nonprofit world and governmental organizations.
Yeah, thanks. You know, that's been my impression as well. And I'll turn both to Kirsten and then Cindy to ask them, what's your sense of that? And do you feel that NGOs and government may have performed a little bit better together over the pandemic than they might have done in the past?
Yeah,
Kirsten,
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great point too about that relationship between government and nonprofits. You can imagine a community where, because they are essentially charities, right? Your local government thinks of these as essentially, you know, a burden, a public burden, right? But there are, particularly in rural communities like we live in, so much of that safety net is carried by the nonprofit sector. And I think that really healthy relationship between nonprofits and the public sector is what really characterizes a strong community. I would say that some of the most inspiring stories we saw during the pandemic revolve around this idea of collaboration. And we've been so impressed by the way that organizations were able to rise to and meet the challenges. And in particular, things that we've alluded to already, things like food banks and childcare organizations, who were able to receive some kind of preemptive or voluntary grants before the most difficult days. And that put them in position to be able to respond to the unknowable. I think of food systems coordination, especially, shows the power of that collaboration. Chris talked about the Milk Money project, where, I mean, it's beautiful when you think about it, a series of strong community support, but relatively modest grants that were able to keep dairymen whole. I mean, there is hardly any business that you could imagine that could be more challenging even in the best of times. and these are not the best of times. They kept dairymen whole, that leveraged the power of local distributors, that got that nutritious local product into food banks and into homes, or things like the Mid-Atlantic Food Resilience and Access Coalition's Taco Tuesday and Community Cooks program. Again, the ripple effect of a couple of small grants to local growers, drawing on the capacity of local distributors like 4P Foods to get food locally processed, and then push it out through, and then prepared by food service workers and chefs and folks who suddenly, had seen their, in restaurants whose businesses had suddenly shuttered, and then draw on the network of local nonprofits, not only food access organizations like Fish and the food banks, but also childcare organizations like Fauquier Community Childcare, and the Fresh program in the public school system. No joke. I mean, this was in many ways the most moving and proudest moment of my career in philanthropy, was seeing the way these organizations leaned into working together. And that's something that we hope the emergency passes, but I hope that connective network never does.
Those are great stories. And one of the questions I was going to tell was to let you tell some stories. You told a few there, Kirsten, and they're very meaningful. The difference between your storytelling and mine is yours tend to be true and mine tend not to be. So I'm glad you shared those. But I'll turn to Cindy and offer her the same opportunity, either to talk a little bit more about the relationship with NGOs and government, but also about how you feel, some good stories that you want to share, or any story you might want to share about nonprofits that sort of went above and beyond during the pandemic.
So I'll go back to the relationship with the nonprofits and the government. And I think, again, I'm going to build on my colleagues who've presented, but I think what I'm seeing is a shift in local government, who is seeing, as we talked about, nonprofits being just charities, to really being part of the integral work of the community. And that extends now into the arts and culture, into environment nonprofits. We realize now to have the whole person, we need to engage them in different ways. We definitely need to meet their basic needs, but we also need to ensure that there's outdoor space for those people that need to have access to the outdoors for their mental health. We also need to ensure that there's an opportunity to engage in cultural activities as part of our mental health as well. So I'm seeing that shift that's happening, that we're no longer, as a nonprofit sector, just charities, but we're part of the quality of life that we partner with local governments to help to create. In terms of inspiring stories, there are so many, even from small nonprofits that are thinking so innovatively about the way they're doing the work. So I work with a small Meals on Wheels organization, and they didn't have volunteers. And so they were thinking creatively. This is at the beginning of the pandemic, and they were thinking creatively about how to do their work. And so they actually thought about what they could do with their volunteers to have them do what their staff was doing, and then engage their staff in transportation. I mean, that's such a simple thing, but even at that level of ensuring that we're getting service to those who really needed food, and recognizing the security concerns and health concerns of our volunteers, how do we make that work in real time with them?
Yeah. Well, and I promise I'll turn to Renard to give me an example of a story that he wants to share with you, but I would be remiss if I didn't let that nice fat pitch that Cindy just floated over my strike zone go unhit. And that was the comment about conservation and outdoor recreation and enjoying the outdoors. What do any of you have suggestions for what a conservation or an environmental organization such as our own can do to address some of the areas that we've talked about here tonight? And I'll start with Kirsten, then go to Cindy, and then I promise, Renard, I'll let you tell your story and you can try that question too. So, Kirsten, you want to go first?
Sure, I appreciate it, because this is a topic that's really dear to my heart. I mentioned earlier that access to care is one of our health priorities, and that aligns really naturally with your question. Open space, canopy, places that are available to the general public and are owned, where there is a real sense of ownership, community ownership and community access there, I think is so important. And it cuts across all of our priorities for PATH, right? You can very naturally see the connection to things like childhood wellness or mental health or senior services, right? I think that one of the most interesting things that comes to my mind is the way that we continue to think around this question of conservation and environmental concerns is how do we continue to think about how small scale private property and community design play into those priorities and how they contribute to conservation and environmental outcomes in the way, as I said, like town parks and tree canopy, but also backyard gardens. These have real environmental impact, and they advance the commitment to quality of life of all residents. So there is a powerful equity commitment embedded in that as well.
Cindy?
So yes, Kirsten, I agree with all of the above. I agree with it all. And if I could just add, since 2020, I am now a certified master naturalist. So like so many other people, I'm like, I want to preserve our outdoors. I want to educate people around why that's so necessary and how do I become part of that movement. And that was the way that I chose to engage, was to become a certified master naturalist. And now I'm in the midst of training the next recruits, and we have more people than we can serve. So I think the awareness is there. People want to engage. They want to engage multi-generationally. And it is an area where it doesn't matter if you have a balcony that you're renting or if you have 4,000 acres, we can all engage in how we protect and conserve our space so that we can all share and enjoy it.
That's great. That's great. And again, my apologies, Renard. I took the opportunity. So what can you share with us?
Not a problem at all. Look, I'm just going to say dinner all night. The ladies are making my job pretty easy. No, I'll tie everything back into one question. So I think my mind, as far as stories go, it's really goes back to childcare, which is a huge a thing that we continue to hear about, that there was a need for it. But also looping that back into kind of your question as far as land conservation and let's talk about green spaces. When we think about childcare, I think what we've come out of the pandemic, hopefully now, is to think about, well, how do those two things kind of play together, right? And so we think about childcare, maybe we imagine it, well, it's this facility or it's a group or XYZ, but imagine during the pandemic, well, wait a minute, you need childcare, but you can't be all huddled up together. But now we're saying, oh, well, wait a minute, we've got childcare facilities that now have a partnership or a collaboration with a group who's got access to a good amount of green space. Oh, now we're seeing the partnership and the connection to how you build these things together. And again, I think our word for the day is going to be partnerships, right? And that's why it's important to say, hey, here's what I do. Here's how I can help you achieve your goal or your objective a little bit better. Hey, we got green space. You get your service you provide is childcare. We need this to kind of get back to normal. And so when those two things came together, I think it made a really great opportunity for the community. So childcare, open space, working together, I think it did wonders for us.
Great. We talked about how the emergency of the pandemic created its own sort of drivers and the responses that were generated in the community's nonprofits, in grant-making organizations, and with grant-making staff, with donors to the nonprofits. Philanthropic spending, however, is an investment. It's an investment in the community. And once the initial food security needs are met, how do you decide how you're going to invest in food service organizations, for instance? So in the wake of the pandemic, I'm not saying we're out of it, but in the wake of the pandemic's at least early stages, how does your organization measure success? Not so much in every grant you make, but in the grant-making process itself. What do you look for in terms of signs of achievement? And we'll start with Renard. I'm going to start with you this time, and even though you're probably not ready, but I'll hit you with that.
No, it's fine. I appreciate the question. I think one of the big things, and as you were saying, hopefully we're coming out of the pandemic, but one of the lessons learned, I think, is going to be reevaluating, and again, reimagining philanthropy. How do we do these things? And I think there are a couple of things that we did or that came out as lessons learned. And so certainly it was evaluating the nonprofits. And again, I talked a little bit about, we changed it from not just looking specifically at just programming, right? But what is your operating budgets? Where are you going? I think one of the big things that's also going to come out of the pandemic is us looking at the 10,000 foot view, right? So if we fund you for XYZ program, okay, we've got that. but how does that program fit into the, the 10,000 foot view of where we're actually going with this thing? And are we getting down to this very specific root causes of what we're trying to look at? So I know with Northern Piedmont Community Foundation, that's one of the things we're trying to address as well with our strategic goals is, here's the list, here's the objectives, but we're going to get down to the root causes as well. And I think that's something that we're going to find out of the pandemic. It highlighted to a certain degree, maybe areas that we didn't pay enough attention to, right? And they were highlighted during the pandemic. And now that we're coming out of it, it's not something that we just forget about. No, we still need to pay a good amount of attention to those specific areas and kind of looking at outcomes, not just programming, but long-term strategic goals and what are the outcomes.
Right. Cindy, how about you? What's CNE seeing in that front?
Sure. So we started prior to 2020 to create these, what we call 7 actionable principles. So we interviewed funders, we interviewed nonprofits, we interviewed community leaders and said, what would it take to create a healthy social sector? We took all of that information, we did our national research, and we came up with 7 actionable principles. And one of them is evaluating impact. So when you look at that, we say, this is what nonprofits can do to evaluate impact. And this is where we think there's opportunity for funders based on our research. And what we found fell into these categories for funders in terms of evaluating impact. Engage in conversations about and fund actionable strategic planning. That's what Renard said. Help nonprofits improve their services and tell their stories by funding responsive program evaluation. So including that as part of your funding, the evaluation piece. Seek impact measures and program evaluation that disaggregates by race. We want to be mindful and acknowledge the disparity that exists. Regularly seek grantees and applicant feedback, were the core things that we found would really lead to success of evaluating impact to create a healthy social sector.
Good. So a checklist, for lack of a better term, but a very detailed one that does require actionable responses.
Exactly.
Kirsten, how about you? What's PATH doing in that area?
I think as we have all night, I'm hearing so many patterns and so much good guidance to the high level or 10,000 feet view of the world that Renard talked about. We came into our grant making from the very beginning, thinking about our community and sort of preparing to benchmark some things against measures like community health needs assessments, what we hear from the community as powerful community need and as proposed ways of filling those needs, but also the aspirations of the community, right? It's not only about the burden of philanthropy, but also the opportunity of philanthropy. And then also looking at things like the CHR&R, Robert Wood Johnson's county health rankings and roadmaps as a general guidance around measures of community health. But for the most part, we're really guided by our community partners. During our application process, for example, we invite those applicants, those community partners, to describe what success and impact mean to them and how that will be served by the grant and the operation supported by the grant. And then our post-grant reporting, which has been actually very much reduced based on all of the feedback that we've had this year, right? But it's really from a growth mindset or curiosity standpoint. What did you learn? What can you teach us? What can you teach the community? What were you able to do with this funding that you might not have otherwise? And that reveals a lot of wisdom, not only about what the organizations are doing, but sort of how they're meeting their need and how they can really, what that indicates for us as far as, future support.
One subject we really have only touched on sort of tangentially is the notion of housing. How does your organization use its funding perhaps, but also its influence to impact the, expanding safe and affordable housing in our communities, and what remains to be done? What else could be done by our organizations or other partners? I'll randomly start with Cindy in that. Sorry.
You did catch me off guard.
All right. My work is done.
So we don't specifically work in housing, but the one thing that I will point out is there is, in addition to everything that's going on locally, which is amazing with the funding opportunities with PATH in Northern Piedmont, There's also LISC, which is the Local Initiative Support Corporation. And the one thing that I would just note about the work they're doing in funding housing is that they're also focused on building wealth, because we know that it's wonderful to have a house to live on, but if we're not helping families to actually create wealth, which is different than income, then the scenario that we're setting up isn't necessarily sustainable long-term.
Gotcha. Renard, how's NPCF responding to this particular need and demand in the community?
Right. I think it's a great question. I think it's something that it's incredibly important. I think we're trying to grapple with it all across the country. And there's no, you can't just put broad brush strokes. It's got to be unique. It's got to fit to your particular area. I think one of the things that Northern Piedmont that we're doing and we're trying to get our heads around here, again, it's that idea of partnerships. And it's that thought process of the 10,000-foot viewpoint, right? So, you were a community foundation. We strengthen the community through philanthropy. So how do we do housing? Well, we don't necessarily need to, buy nails, and we're not going to put up houses. But wait a minute, how about one of the groups we work with is Habitat for Humanity? So look to see, what are they doing? Okay, well, they're doing housing. All right. So then we're looking at, all right, well, if we can do housing here, that's part of the solution, right? But, housing with, not a lot of access to education, then you're still gonna have a problem. So are we partnering also with groups of these guys do education? Okay. And then you start to look at, okay, well, I've got housing, I've got education. Well, there's got to be a transition point, right? So then you look at the groups that we're also partnering with who maybe do some bill payments right now to help these folks kind of transition to a place where they can, now they've got an opportunity to do a Habitat for Humanity house. They've got an opportunity to look at these educational opportunities. They've got an opportunity to also to, take care of some immediate bills right now. We all want to do education, we want to do housing, but if you got bills right now to pay, that's going to be on the front of your mind. And so, trying to get to the end of the race, you're like, I'd love to get there, but I've got my bills on my desk. I can't do that right now. So really looking to work with all of the groups, 10,000-foot viewpoint, and kind of having that roadmap of where are we going with this thing, I think is one of the biggest things that Northern Piedmont is trying to do coming out of the pandemic.
Great, thank you. Kirsten, same question.
Sure. Yeah, we have found ourselves moving more and more assertively into the areas of housing in response to what we're hearing from the community. We work very closely with Habitat, or have worked extensively with Habitat, starting with the Hayti Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, in which PEC was such a crucial partner in documenting the rich history of that neighborhood and community, as well as chain of custody, right? Even looking at, title on some of those houses, which was such an important piece. So we supported that initiative, as well as the new Horner Street, which is going to add right in the heart of town mixed use affordable housing, mixed income affordable housing, that I think is going to be a huge leap forward for our community. Similarly, in Culpeper County, we've supported the Ann Wingfield and Parkside developments in Culpeper, and we've supported critical home repair in Rappahannock. When we talk about housing, we're not only talking about new housing stock, right, but safe and secure existing housing, particularly in isolated and older populations like we see in parts of Rappahannock. John, you asked the question about opportunities. I think in this community, we have tremendous opportunity around missing middle housing.
Sure.
We live in a community with a lot of large, a disproportionate number, one would say, of large, expensive single family homes, and a significant lack of mixed use or multifamily or garden court housing, which is more affordable and oddly enough is more traditional in a small town setting. Town of Warrenton, for example, estimates that we have about half of the housing stock that would be needed for a viable work-live community. So this has an effect on our workforce as well, and it gets into those wealth and income and equity issues that have been alluded to by the other speakers. The Regional Commission estimates that we have a shortage, if I remember correctly, it's close to 2,000 affordable housing units across the region. And I want to be really clear, I'm talking about our friends and neighbors who are already living here, people who are significantly unhoused or underhoused, who are our friends and neighbors living here now. So I think that we have opportunities, particularly within the town limits, within all of the towns, I'm not just specifically speaking about Warrenton, but all of the towns may have significant opportunity for infill in the way that they were designed to do, in ways that would have real benefit to the health and well-being, economic opportunity, and main street life vitality of those communities. So I would love to see that approached mindfully and intentionally.
Sure, sure. Turning back to your organizations as grant-making organizations, increasingly philanthropic organizations are moving toward program-related investments, PRIs, or mission-related investments, MRIs, which really have a longer-term feel to them. They're investments that may involve cash and resources that go over a rather longer period of time, and therefore have a longer period of recovery, if you will, in terms of whether that's return on investment, however that's measured. How do you see that shaping philanthropy in our region in the coming years? And we'll start with you, Kirsten.
I think it's one of the most exciting things we're seeing coming out of philanthropy. The South in general is our philanthropy, or philanthropy culture is maybe not as far along as some other parts of the country in terms of like embracing some new tools of philanthropy like impact investing. But I think that's rapidly changing. I think that when we think about the opportunities that we see around the country and now experimentally in the South, for example, the ability to mobilize regenerated or regenerative funds, funds that are put into the community for the sake of community benefit, and then come back in the form of some modest financial return, which can then be reinvested in the community, as opposed to a grant that goes out once and never comes back. Grants are the main tool in our toolkit, but the potential for impact investing to have this sort of regenerative or amplifying effect is tremendous. There are communities around the country, for example, that have built community centers, all the things that we've talked about tonight, community centers and parks and food hubs and food systems. And each of those then comes back and goes back out into the community for the next major project. We have started experimenting with this with the Path Foundation and, for example, the Hair and Wellness, or investment in 4P Foods. Our desire there was to invest in agricultural infrastructure. And what proceeded from that was things like new jobs and opening new markets for local growers and really strengthening the agricultural economy in the region. So I think, I think it's a tool that has tremendous potential, and I'm excited to see us and other philanthropists in the area starting to really think about the power of their impact investing policies.
Renard, how does NPCF look at those kind of impact investments?
So that's something that we're doing quite yet. It's something that I think we're looking to try and get into in the future as well. I do think it kind of falls back a little bit on what we've talked about as well, though, with the ability to look at the 10,000-foot viewpoint and say, what's the need? Where are we going with this? What's the root cause? And then take our resources and then use our influence as well to kind of start addressing those very root causes. So it's not something we're doing quite yet, but on the other hand, we are trying to look at, again, root causes, looking at how to kind of use our influence to try and tackle those things.
Right, that's fine. And Cindy, can you talk a little bit about how impact investing is being viewed in the broader region, maybe beyond the Fauquier, Rappahannock, Culpeper area?
Sure. Well, I can tell you this is new, right? I mean, we don't have a lot of players in this space. In this impact investing space, and from a nonprofit perspective, that's the perspective I'm bringing. There's a little bit of caution around that, right? So there's some educational opportunities that I think need to occur for nonprofits to understand this model, to understand how they can fully appreciate it and engage in the model. With that, there's eagerness and interest. I think just a little bit of education, because there's not a lot in the space. So it's not as if we can look down the road and say, oh, this is a successful impact investing endeavor. I want to do that. So you're looking for those entrepreneurial, right? Those organizations that are on the cusp of wanting to partner and be innovative in this space with you
Yeah.
as a
Yeah, it's like most things that are exciting. It's also very challenging and a little bit scary at times
It's
too.
scary,
So,
right? That's a good word. It's a little scary, especially since we're post 2020, right?
yeah. You're always worried
It's
about
like-
the next disaster, and it's hard to think about a far longer term than that. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to apologize to the many people who have asked great questions, either directly to me or in the broader chat. I've tried to weave a couple of them into the discussions we've had. I do want to get to at least one more question, however, so I'm going to have to try to get to that one first, and we'll see what time we may have left after that. Kirsten, you've expressed in the past that you look at a PATH and other grant-making organizations as more matchmaker than grant maker. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of foundations using their resources to connect existing resources in communities? We talked a little bit about government and nonprofits. We've talked a little about nonprofits partnering together, but how do you think that actionable, direction by PATH and other grant-making organizations can really lead to broader impact?
I think it's everything that we've been talking about tonight. In 2013, when the PATH Foundation was created, one of our advisors, John, you'll remember this, one of our advisors said, just remember, you are not in the giving away money business. You're actually in the business of investing in community with the expectation of return in the form of a healthier, happier, more equitable community, right? And the way that we do that then is by sitting on steering committees and going to public meetings and meeting one-on-one with nonprofits in the community. I think if you've never called the PATH Foundation, you might be surprised how eager we are to meet with members of the community. And that's really baked into our culture. The board, in its wisdom years ago, really empowered the staff, really encouraged the staff to spend all of the time to be as transparent and available as possible, because it is those connections and those relationships of trust that are going to teach us what we need to know. And because of that, we often have a front row seat on some incredibly cool ideas and amazing work that's happening in the community, and have the opportunity to see patterns emerging and be able to say, you know what? I have now a to-do list to introduce, to facilitate, to connect you to the next person. So we often leave those meetings. So whether it's a one-on-one or a group meeting with local nonprofits, where the program staff have a long to-do list of introductions to make and conversations to facilitate, because that's really where the magic happens, is in those connective links that happen on the ground between the community and the folks who are doing the work.
Renard, how about Northern Piedmont Community Foundation?
Sure. No, I think one of the things that Cindy hit on, I think that's greater, and Kristen as well, it's about those relationship building. I had the opportunity to work with our executive director, Jane Bowen Wilson, who's fantastic over at Northern Piedmont Community Foundation. So last week we got an opportunity to sit down with a gentleman he had just created his nonprofit. It was geared at education for spotting and teaching folks how to combat elder financial abuse, which is huge right now. And it's the opportunity to work with groups who are just starting off, they're fired up, they're passionate, and then be able to sit across the table with them and say, okay, here's what we've experienced, or here's this resource. And then it's also about kind of the partnerships, right? Okay, well, after we had spoken with them, we said, all right, we need to take you down to go see the folks at PATH. And we actually, let's go take you over to the folks at C&E. And let me introduce you to the folks at Healthy Culpeper or the PRC group meeting, but it's the relationship building as well. And then also, I think one of the other issues is it's the ability that we've also seen is to use as a nonprofit, to use our boots on the ground experience to also work with the government agencies, right? When we talk about affordable housing, again, we have concepts and thoughts in our mind of what it looks like, but the folks who have their boots on the ground and they see the folks coming in their door, do they take the calls of the folks who've been, hey, I'm a senior, I'm on a fixed income, my job's gone down, and now I can't make my rent. That's a image that our nonprofits have. And so to take that image and that understanding of the problem, and then to work with our government agencies as far as addressing it, it's just a huge opportunity that I think we're just kind of coming to grips, coming out of the pandemic as well, the ability to partner with government organizations as well.
That's great, Renard. And by force of circumstance, my inept management and the inexorable demands of the clock, Cindy, you're going to get the last word on that subject.
Trust-based philanthropy. That's what we're talking about, right? It's all about trust. So again, going back to 2020, those organizations that had experience and were fortunate enough to have a partner that was a trust-based philanthropist, they could go to them in March of 2020 and say, this is the reality. This is what's happening. I need to let you know this. We're making pivots. I'm going to be asking for this kind of investment from you. That's the magic when it comes together.
Yeah, it does involve a certain amount of checking one's ego at the door and bringing experience you have to bear, but be acknowledging that you don't know everything and there's a whole lot of other people trying to do good work, and there's usually great ways to partner.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to force that as being the final word on the subject. I think all of us would be willing to discuss these subjects for hours yet, but we're going to have to acknowledge the fact that some people don't like to hear the sound of my voice any more than they've already heard it. So we're going to go ahead and say thank you all very much. Thanks very much to our three panelists for participating tonight and giving us the benefit of their wisdom and experience. Thanks to all of you who participated and watched. As James has already said, we've recorded this session, so we'll be passing it on and sending you a link, and you'll be able to share it with others. Chris, do you have any final words for us before we sign off?
I just want to thank you all again for your participation, and particularly for your support of all the great organizations in our communities. I think, as a partner on many things, what we've experienced over the last couple of years is people digging in and finding ways to do things together, get them done. And it's really been exciting across the board. There's good things starting to happen. And I hope that energy will continue. I know you guys are going to make it possible as we go forward. So thanks for tonight, and thanks for all you do.
Everybody take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.